Yeah, Tony. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon in Europe, and also good morning in the Americas, and wherever you are listening. Um, Catherine and Tony have asked me to give my most recent reflections on age-appropriate drug formulations for children, and of course, I'm very happy to do so, and how to approach the GRID network to get some more insights in our research. First of all, I would like to introduce very briefly, for those of you who are not EU citizens and are not working in the European pharmacopoeia world, that we have a new EU regulation coming into force in 2007, introducing a new pediatric committee as a European Medicines Agency, the EMA in London, UK. And I can tell you this was really a complete new stepstone on our work, a milestone on our work on pediatric drug formulations. The European regulation introduced a pediatric investigation plan, which is mandatory if you want to submit a dossier for a marketing license, a marketing authorization within the European Union for new chemical entities. You have to submit such a pediatric investigation plan, and it is made as a stick and carrot principle. The stick is, of course, that you have to submit such a plan, and the carrot is that you can apply for supplementary protection certificate at your local patent office, which grants you a market exclusivity for +6 months, or if it is a drug for an orphan disease, for 24 months. There's another part of this regulation concerning the old drug substances which are out of patent, and for those the European regulation set up a pediatric use marketing authorization. In this pediatric investigation plan, we should specify the timing and the measures proposed to assess the quality, safety, and efficacy of the medicinal product in all subsets of the pediatric population. And this is an important sentence because all subsets of the pediatric population mean different age groups within the pediatric population, and it is quite probable that you have to develop more than one formulation, except the adult formulation, of course. In this pediatric investigational plan, you should describe any measures to adapt the formulation of the medicinal product to make its use more acceptable, safe, or more effective for the different subsets. You will find different subsets of the pediatric age groups in the International Committee on Harmonization E11 guideline, clinical investigation of medicinal products in the pediatric population, starting with preterm newborn infants, then term newborn infants, up to 1 month of age, and starting from 1 month of age to 2 years, there are the infants and toddlers. Children's group is from 2 years to 11 years, and the adolescent period from 12 years up to adulthood. There's another age categorization performed in the CHMP reflection paper of the EMA, formulations of choice for the pediatric population, which subdivides the group of children from 2 years to 11 years into 2 groups, 2 to 5 years and 6 to 11 years, addressing the differences between preschool children and school children. I will go on this topic later on. So if we have to develop age-appropriate drug formulations, we should have some categories, some topics to address. And of course, the first one is that our drug substance should have a sufficient bioavailability, that our pediatric formulation should contain safe excipients only, and safe means safety in children, which is not necessarily the case if you use excipients which have been shown to be safe in adults. Our formulation should have palatable or at least acceptable properties regarding taste, regarding texture in the mouth, but this is a very huge topic which can be addressed maybe in another seminar later on. Acceptable dose uniformity is an important topic, easy and safe administration to the child. There should be at least an acceptable social, cultural acceptability for the children, and there should be a brief and clear product information. So these are the most important categories, and I will give you some examples, and I will go into some details for the excipients and also for the acceptable dose uniformity and administration procedure. So first of all, a very busy slide from my friend and colleague Gregory Kearns from the United States. If you want to learn more about the particularities of pharmacokinetic variables in children, you should read this review paper. Just a brief overview here. In children, you often find a different pattern of metabolic enzymes, for example, from the cytochrome P family, especially in the very young children, meaning the neonates and also the infant period. By this, you will have different pharmacokinetic profiles of your drug substances, but this could also mean that there are differences in the pharmacokinetics of excipients. And this is a major concern if we are talking about drug formulations for children. Our recent Bible is a reflection paper, Formulations of Choice for the Pediatric Population. This was a reflection paper released by the European Medicines Agency in 2006. And up to now, it's the only guidance we have on pediatric drug formulations. In this paper, it was stated that although excipients should be pharmacologically inactive, they may indeed cause adverse effects. And particularly when used in pediatric formulation, it has to be kept in mind that the physiology of neonates and infants differs considerably from that of adults. And therefore, we have to consider all safety issues which may come across with the excipient used in other medications. The question is how to deal with these problems. So there's another paper out now since 2011. This is a draft guideline on pharmaceutical development of medicines for pediatric use. And now, 5 years later, starting from the reflection paper, there are some new thoughts on excipients, new thoughts on age-appropriate drug formulations, and therefore it is really worth to consider this draft guideline. And of course, if the guideline is set into force maybe next year, then it becomes valid, and then it becomes the new guideline where we have to adhere to. In this draft guideline, you find the sentence: the suitability of an excipient in the pediatric medicine is a key element of the pharmaceutical development process. So it's really important to have a look into your composition, into your formulation to get an age-appropriate medicine. What does it mean in detail? So the following aspects should be considered in the drug development process if you select an appropriate excipient. The pharmaceutical, technological characteristics of the excipients and potential alternatives should be considered. So you have to think about your function, the excipient function, and of course potential alternatives which might have better performance, but also a better safety profile. The safety profile of the excipients should be provided for all indicate the target age groups for which the medication is made, and you have to consider that some medications are on the basis of a single dose, a single daily exposure, and maybe a daily exposure, maybe a long life treatment, maybe only a single use. So the expected duration of the treatment has to be considered too. The criticality of the condition is to be considered. The characteristics of the disease, the particularities of the disease, maybe the disease goes together with swallowing issues, then it is of course very important to think about your drug dosage form, and by this to think about your drug formulation as well. Manufacturability, okay, is an issue of course in pharmaceutical industry, and the excipients sometimes may not cause acute sensitization, but I will come to that later on. In the year 2007, my colleague Joachim Boos and myself compiled some fatal outcomes which have been reported in literature to show the most important issues with pharmaceutical excipients when they were used in neonates or infants, and also in older children. This was just a compilation, which should not mean that these excipients cannot be used in children, because I'm convinced that it's all about exposure of these pharmaceutical excipients to children in the different age groups. For example, we have found a number of publications on the toxicity of benzyl alcohol in children used orally but also parenterally as a preservative, and sometimes, some years ago in the United States, also as a diluent, causing neurotoxicity and metabolic acidosis. Of course, everybody of you may know that ethanol is not quite healthy for very young children. There's a long debate ongoing whether ethanol should be completely eliminated from drug formulations for children, which is sometimes very difficult because you might have some residual ethanol content, for example, from plant extraction for phytochemical and herbal medicines. And you all know that ethanol can cause neurotoxicity in these children. Polyethylene glycol is another concern, especially if administered parenterally. Polysorbate 20 or 80, also called Team 20 and 80, if administered parenterally, have led to liver and kidney failures. This could be due to the fact that those two excipients are substrates of the P-glycoprotein, which is a very important efflux transporting system in the human body. And propylene glycol, which is used as a diluent, and sometimes at high concentrations in your formulation also as a replacement for a preservative. And this propylene glycol is used orally and parenterally, also sometimes in dermal preparations. We have not found any literature on critical outcomes after dermal application, but at least for oral and parenteral administration, there have been several severe adverse reactions being reported in literature, like seizures, neurotoxicity, and hyperosmolarity. And I will go into details in a minute. So there's a paper from Whitaker and co-workers from the year 2009, and there you find some clinical data of the ethanol exposure in neonates who were treated with a common drug formulation with dexamethasone. And what you see is that you get in some cases very high drug concentrations in the blood or in the serum of the children. And the dotted line here is representing the intake of a unit of alcohol per week for an average man, which is of course much bigger and has a higher body mass. So you get high ethanol exposure at certain concentrations with using certain drug formulation, and this is a matter of concern. Then, because think of some studies which have been conducted some years ago when children who were receiving the breast milk of their mothers who drank a lot of ethanol, then it was reported that there were also problems with the maturation of the brain of the child. And if you expose these children to ethanol by your medications, it could be also an issue. So propylene glycol is a very well investigated substance in children now. In the 80s, there were the first reports on fatal outcomes, hyperosmolality, as I said already, increased incidence of seizures in low birth weight infants after getting normal doses of medications which contained propylene glycol. And in 1996, it was another report to save diluent that continues to cause harm. In the year 2000, Glaxo Wellcome had to limit the indication up to 4 years, because of the high amount of propylene glycol in a generous oral solution. If you think this story has now ended, I can tell you in 2011 there was another FDA drug safety communication warning serious health problems seen in premature babies given Caletra or its solution. Caletra also contains high amounts of propylene glycol. So it's absolutely clear that this excipient can cause harm in very young children. The question is, what is the acceptable dose? And this is, of course, very difficult to assess because you can never make an investigation prospectively in children applying as much excipient as you want until you see the first severe adverse drug events. Fortunately, this will never happen. Therefore, we have to find other ways how to assess acceptable or at least tolerable values in children. So interestingly, we have some data on propylene glycol exposure already. The mean exposure in the publication of Whittaker to propylene glycol is reported in this figure, and you see sometimes after receiving a dexamethasone treatment, the values in the very young children are higher than the WHO limits which are recommended originally for adults. An interesting investigation was made by Karel Allegaard and co-workers from the University of Leiden, and I was really happy that I've seen today that we will invite Karel also to give a webinar because he did all the detailed investigations on the exposure of propylene glycol in children as an almost standard procedure when he is investigating the pharmacokinetics of drug substances. And if there's propylene glycol included in the medication, he will add this investigation, this data, to his results. And what you see here clearly is that the exposure of propylene glycol and the concentration in the plasma is quite scattering in children. You see very high values of almost 90, I would say, 90 milligrams per liter, which is quite much also for adults, I would say. And Karel can tell you more about what he thinks is an acceptable limit. In his publications, he writes something around 34 seems to be well tolerated, but it should not be more, of course. But listen to his talk, I can really recommend it. Very good data, very new data. So in our EU PFI, the European Pediatric Formulation Initiative, the toxicity and safety of excipients is one of our major work streams we have there. And together with EU PFI and the National Institute of Health and the Pediatric Formulation Initiative of the United States, we are working on a database of safety and toxicity of excipients for pediatrics, which does not exist before, but now we are setting up this database and fill it with the data which is upcoming, which has been recorded from literature. But as I already said, there are a number of studies ongoing. I can also mention here the SME program, another big program which is working at the moment on the safety and toxicity of excipients. And I hope we get much more data soon on this topic. You can see in such a STEP database general information, but then very detailed information on the administration and exposure by different routes, the safety, tolerability, adverse effects, and so on and so on. So it's a compilation of our knowledge starting from preclinical data, but then also going into clinical data. And if there's something in the literature, you can also see something from the literature which is particularly addressing children. But I must say, for a number of excipients, you will not find anything in the literature, and therefore I support this type of research like Karel does in Leuven very much at the moment, because we must have certain limits where we can work with and give pharmaceutical industry the advice what the tolerable or acceptable concentration of these excipients is. We should also always think that there are a number of excipients, or I call them contaminants, in our drug formulations which are not labeled, which are undisclosed sometimes, and maybe sometimes even unknown. Of course, we all know from adult drug preparations that depending on the manufacturing processes, residual solvents can be present, but you have to know that these residual solvents, which are controlled by a so-called PDE value, a permitted daily exposure value, have been calculated based on amino data, but have been calculated for adults and not for children, and therefore we should always think whether the residual solvents we have in our medication might be appropriate or might be harmful for children even. The same is true for pesticides, where we have a lot of different limits which are well established, but which have never been assessed for children. Heavy metals, for example, coming from catalysts in the synthesis, also maybe plasticizers, which might come from your formulation if they are intended to plasticize a film, for example. But they can also come from your packaging, from the packaging material, either from the packaging of the active pharmaceutical ingredient, or from bulk containers, or even from the finished product. And this is also a concern. We try to eliminate some plasticizers out of our drug formulations, but if they re-enter the formulation from packaging material, it must be controlled, of course. There's another point, and these are the flavor components. Flavor components, which are often used in pediatric medicines, may cause allergies. Often they are not disclosed by the flavor companies or the suppliers of the flavors, and therefore it is also a matter of concern. If you ask myself, the best drug preparation would be always flavor-free, but I agree, of course, that sometimes it is difficult to make it possible because of the taste properties and maybe also the smell properties of pharmaceutical preparations. We should also think about the microbial burden, which is limited by several monographs in the European and also US pharmacopoeia. And this has also been done for adults, of course. The limit has been set for adults, but we have to consider whether this microbial burden in oral medications, like in tablets, for example, can also be transferred, let's say, to neonates, where such a burden could be an issue for the very young child. And other contaminants from plant materials, so mix-ups in herbal medicines, is another issue in this particular type of drug formulations. I give you a case study. I was very surprised when we worked some years ago on sodium benzoate. In this particular case, not for preservation, but as an API, as an active pharmaceutical ingredient. We learned that sodium benzoate is monographed, of course, in the pharmacopoeias, but the actual synthesis route is not reflected by the pharmacopoeia, because nowadays most companies, most suppliers synthesize sodium benzoate out from toluene, forming first benzoic acid in an organic procedure, and then they add sodium hydroxide to the benzoic acid in an aqueous procedure, and this gives sodium benzoate in the end. Nobody in the pharmacopoeia thought about the initial product, the EDAC product, toluene, because everybody thought it cannot be present in sodium benzoate because the last step of the synthesis is in an aqueous environment, and toluene will not dissolve in water. But if you look into the analytical data we did for several sodium benzoate qualities, you often find the toluene peak here, and it's of course very important for pediatric purposes, especially if you are using high doses of sodium benzoate, that you control this toluene peak. Otherwise, it can, of course, a contaminant, which is not really a solvent in this particular case. It's more or less a product of the synthesis, or the starting point of the synthesis. And again, if you look into the pharmacopoeia, you will find a limit concentration of 890 ppm, which is equal at a dose of 10 gram of this drug per day to 8.9 milligram per day permitted daily exposure for toluene. But this has been calculated and related to a woman with a body weight of 50 kilograms. And this is definitely not true for the 3 kilogram neonates we have to treat with sodium benzoate, because they have hyperglycemia or hyperammonemia. And then, of course, it is a matter of concern. That means you have to rethink about your whole formulation. You should carefully think about the needs and, of course, the potential harm which you may cause by your preparation. I also addressed hypersensitization, hypersensitive patients, and there is a paradigm at the moment in this type of medicine, that the earlier you apply an allergen to very young children, the more probable is the development of an allergy. And if this is true, then we should at least avoid these allergens in the very young children. In the best case, we avoid them completely, of course. So we know about dyes, benzalkonium chloride, chlorocresol, and so on. And here are also the parabens on this list. And when Joachim Boos and myself compiled this list, we didn't know that there are some recent publications now on hormonal action of these parabens too. So now I would address these parabens not only in the group of the hypersensitive allergenic compounds, but also in the compounds which are of risk in the use for children, especially the parabens with longer alkyl chains. The longer the alkyl chains, the higher is the binding at the binding site of the estrogenic receptor. And nobody knows at the moment which these findings, which have been made in animals, in juvenile animals, really mean. But in these animals, the development of sexual organs were affected, and this is, of course, a real concern if you think about the very young children, because it can happen that a treatment in the very early life period can affect you lifelong, and this is, of course, not acceptable. If this is confirmed in human beings, as it was found in in animals. So just to give you an idea about the impact of these excipient matters, the excipient issues we have, here are two different PETCO opinions, the Pediatric Committee of the EMA, and I've blinded these opinions, but I think it's quite helpful to look into the wording. One opinion here is the proposed formulation with the undisclosed excipient is not acceptable. It cannot be authorized as long as no experimental data are presented that other technically possible formulations with less toxic excipients have substantial disadvantages. This means, of course, that you will get into problems, you will struggle if you want to continue with this excipient. My recommendation is that if you go for such a PIP procedure, you should think about a decision tree, which are the excipients which are already on the market, which are the excipients which are listed to be, for example, generally regarded as safe, or which are listed at least in the EFSA list of E numbers in the European Union, which could be a helpful database for that. There's also such a decision tree given in the draft guideline on the quality of medicines, of pediatric medicines, which are introduced already, and this I think is quite helpful, and I really hope that this decision tree will continue in the finished guideline, because this could be really helpful for pharmaceutical industry. Another PETCO opinion, the main concern is the presence of the preservatives, hydroxybenzoate esters, and sorbic acid, and it is a product for long-term continuous use. The development of a multi-particulate dosage form should be started. Hydrobenzoic acids, esters, like the parabens, which were mentioned already. And I can tell you, if you want to use propylparaben at the moment, you will struggle here in this process. So think about a decision tree on the best preservatives in your particular case, and in the best case, you can avoid these preservatives. Another issue we have with liquid formulations is not only that we have these diluents and preservatives and maybe antioxidants, which are a matter of concern, but we could also show that some of the application devices, the dosing devices, are not really useful. The very often used dosing spoons, which often accompany the finished product, show some uncertainties, especially if you administer lower volumes of your medication, of your liquid medication, because they have been often calibrated with water to get the status of a medical device. But if you use afterwards suspension of, in this case, amoxicillin or erythromycin, you will get volume scattering results. If you use half of a spoon, the average of all amoxicillin products on the German market was measured as 125% of the labeled claim. That means a quarter more than labeled, and I think this is also not acceptable. The reason is that the cohesion of the liquid is different from water, and therefore you still see the graduation, and of course you will fill your dosage spoon until you will not see anymore the graduation. And this means overdosing, and in the case of a quarter of the spoon, it can be up to 50%. Not in a single product, in the average of all products on the German market. There are some more fancy, more advanced delivery devices, administration devices at hand. For example, the pulp spoons from Sandoz HR company or Egalet company, and they are filled with multi-particulates, often coated granules to improve the taste properties. These single doses are first of all put into water, then they swell, giving a kind of slurry, which is tasteless or which has a very good taste, maybe a sweet taste, maybe, and then they are administered after putting the film off, they are administered to the children. Then there are some dose-sipping devices which have been on the market or are still on the market. The Grünwald straw, unfortunately, has been discontinued due to cost reasons in the German market. I think it was very helpful because the child could choose the beverage of its choice, and then the Grünwald straw was put into the liquid, into the beverage, and the dose was shipped. You find here a pacifier from BioGlam, and here on the right-hand side you see a single dose spoon developed from Pfizer. So there are some advantages of the solid dosage forms over the liquid dosage forms. I talked already about the non-toxic excipients. In many countries of the world, the price of the solid dosage forms is cheaper. The reason for that is the transport costs, the storage costs, for example, by storing in refrigerators or by cooling down the halls where they are stored. And therefore you have a number of advantages of the solid dosage forms. But on the other hand, of course, because it's a solid dosage form, there might be an issue of swallowing, the dimension might be a problem, and often you need a liquid for the swallowing, and the main concern is, of course, aspiration. That means also a safety concern. So in the already mentioned formulations of choice paper, you find a table, and green light here means very useful, formulation of choice. Red color means not useful for children, and you see that to that time we all thought, I think, that solid dosage forms are not useful for children below the age of 6 years old, or maybe even smaller particles, not even useful for children below 2 years. There's only one publication, to my knowledge, who investigated this in detail, and this is the work of Joerg and co-workers from the Netherlands. And in the Dutch licensed product, they found that there is a shift from the solid to the liquid formulations at the age of 5 years, and by this the table was also made, or we supported the table of the reflection paper. But if you look carefully into the publication and the raw data, you will see that this is only true for the licensed drug medications. If you look to the off-label use of these drugs, then you will find that the shift from the solid to the liquid dosage form is much earlier, between 2 and 3 years. And there's another paper out from the WHO, and the WHO, because of the cost reasons and all the particularities of the developing countries, demands flexible solid dosage forms, which can be made in conventional facilities and using usual excipients that ensure stability and palatability. So a very good example, I think, is a multifunctional tablet here from Coartem, the Coartem product from Novartis, and you can put it into a liquid forming a suspension, or you put it on a spoon where it also forms a suspension if you put some drops of liquid on it. And then it is very stable in your package, but it can be easily administered to the child afterwards. But if you want to adapt the dose for children, you need some methodologies, of course, for dose titration to cover as much children as you can. And that means, of course, that we need multi-particulate dosage forms, for example, like mini tablets and spherical granules, which are also called pellets. But there is, up to now, not really accepted data on acceptability of these multi-particulates out in the literature. There were some investigations of PET and Tulo in London on 3 millimeter mini tablets, for example, but there has never been a control in these studies, so a real crossover check with liquid formulations. And therefore we did 2 mini tablets studies. First of all, an exploratory study, and now we have the confirmatory study, and I can present the results. In the confirmatory study, we investigated not only uncoated mini tablets 2 mm diameter and glucose syrup, as we did for the exploratory study, but we also included now the coated mini tablets. And with these three different formulations, we investigated the acceptability and the swallowability in 6 different age groups, starting with 6 months up to 6 years. The categories 1 to 5 can be summed up very briefly. The best criterion, number 1, was the mini tablet or the complete volume administered was swallowed as it is completely. This is criterion 1. Second was if the child would chew on the mini tablet, then it would be categorized as number 2. Or in the case of the syrup, if not the entire volume is swallowed, but there's a runlet, for example, out of the mouth, a rinsing out of the mouth, then it was categorized as number 2. If the formulation was spat out, 3. If there was choking on the formulation, type 4. And 5 was complete refuse to take. And simply shaking the head like this was already categorized as criterion number 5, refuse to take, and the study was stopped. So, to our surprise, we found that the capability to swallow, which means the categories 1 in our list, was almost the same for the uncoated mini tablet as for the syrup. But even more surprisingly, it was also almost the same for the coated mini tablet. And you can only see this, of course, if you investigate both the liquid and the solid formulation. If you put all data together from all different age categories, you will find that there is even a significant superiorness of the uncoated mini tablet, but also the coated mini tablet over the syrup. So our paradigm that the syrup would be much more accepted and much better swallowed, especially in the very young children, was wrong for all the years. And if you sum up categories number 1 and number 2, so accepting that the child might a little bit chew on the tablet, yeah, then we'll see even more an advantage of the uncoated mini tablets. In case of the coated mini tablets, we have to think about whether it is acceptable or not that the child chew on the tablet, because the coated mini tablets can have a functional coating which might affect, of course, the acceptability in the end. So some data on safety. All 3 galenic formulations were well tolerated. None of the children choked on the syrup. And I can add from the exploratory study, these were not only 306 children, plus 60 children from the exploratory study, so we have now 366 children in our study included in both studies. None of the children choked on the uncoated mini tablet, but we have 2 in the very young age group from 6 months to 1 year who choked on the coated mini tablet without clinical relevance, but still this is an indication for us that we should distinguish not the age groups, not the sizes and so on, but we should distinguish between the properties of these mini tablets. If they are coated, and that means if they have to be swallowed as a monolithical dosage form, we should consider that there's a difference in the age group until 1 year. Okay, so what we don't know at the moment is what will happen if we wouldn't administer only a single mini tablet, but more mini tablets. This is a study which we are planning now, and we are also planning to go with the uncoated mini tablet even into the neonates in the children between 0 and 6 months. We can even improve the properties by using these oral dispersible mini tablets, so they disappear, disintegrate in the mouth within some seconds. We have already manufactured oral dispersible mini tablets which completely disintegrate within a few seconds. 2 or 3 seconds should be enough if the formulation is well done. And then I don't see any aspiration risk, any problem, no particle inhalation. Then these mini tablets will behave as drops, I would say. Flexible dosing is an issue with these multiparticulates. You have some products on the market already using granules or sprinkles, sometimes with a dosing spoon. Sometimes these products are packaged in a capsule shell, so the capsule is opened and then the content is sprinkled over food, for example. There are also some prototypes and also one marketed product with dosing devices. The marketed product is a pancreatine product with a certain amount of mini tablets which are easily counted by this dosing spoon. There's a new device upcoming. A prototype was presented at the last EU PFI conference in Prague this year, and I think it could be also very helpful for really counting the correct number of these multiparticulates. It is more or less based on a former patent application from our working group, but it's much more advanced now from the German company Alder Medical but in-house. Another oral dispersible film formulation which might be very interesting, and I see a good future for them, are these oral dispersible films. They can be packaged, they can be cut into pieces, into different pieces, resulting in different dose strengths from another roll, which is simply cut it in the acceptable dose for children. And also these films can be manufactured in a way that they will disintegrate completely within some seconds. Of course, in both cases, all dispersible tablets, mini tablets, or films, you have to think about taste masking properties if your API is very bitter or has another unpleasant taste. But as I said already, this is a complete different issue where we can talk another webinar on this topic. So I would conclude after my 45 minutes. Age-appropriate drug dosage forms for children must be appropriate for the targeted pediatric subset, and this could mean, in the worst case for pharmaceutical industry, that you need different drug formulations in the different subsets of the pediatric population, which is, of course, very costly, and I think everybody is aware of that, but costs should not be the only rationale here. You should really think about your drug formulation, and you should look into different dosage forms which enable you to cover as much pediatric subsets as possible. And I think by the oral dispersible formulation, I showed you some examples how this could work. There are some new ideas which came up in the last 2 or 3 years. Still some improvement to be made, of course. At the moment, it's sometimes difficult to find consistent regulation on these new dosage forms, or fortunately they are now included in the European Pharmacopoeia, but still there are a lot of gaps in the analytical methods for characterizing these new dosage forms, and this I think needs some more time. And sometimes I hear from the pharmaceutical company everybody wants to be the second but not the first introducing these new dosage forms. And we need, of course, much more clinical evidence of acceptability and age appropriateness of these dosage forms in children. And I can promise you that our working group will continuously work on that, and we have a lot of projects on this acceptability to really prove that our dosage forms are more safe and maybe more affordable also for developing countries than the formerly used liquid formulations, which we thought, me too, for all the years, would be better for the very young children, and I have changed my mind completely on this topic. I thank you very much for listening, and of course I will be happy to answer your questions in the chat function here, and I'm really looking forward to your comments. Thank you very much.